Yeah, folks here. We have folks joining us from Zoom. We're recording. So sort of mixed bag this morning. We're going to wait one more minute and then we'll get started. It's good to see people in person. I think I've only been in it because I was out in the pavilion church for a long time. And so I've only been in the sanctuary once or twice because I've been other places in the building. So it's good to be with you guys in this space today. All right, let's get started. Let me open us in a word of prayer, and then I'll sort of explain what we're doing today because it's sort of plan B. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day. Even though it's cold outside, we see the sun, and we know that you are still sovereign over your creation. We thank you that we are wonderfully made, that you created us and has created us as whole beings and created us in a very complex way. Be with us today as we talk about some of the hardships that we face when we live this life here on earth and how we can best help each other as members of the body of Christ here at Hardersville. And so we ask your blessing on this discussion. We thank all this in the name of Jesus, your son. Amen. All right, so some of you were expecting, today is Sanctity of Life Sunday. Some of you are expecting to see Dave Eckert or knew that there was a person named Dave Eckert who was going to come talk to us today. Due to some scheduling things in Dave's church where he's on pastoral staff, he has to preach there. He's going to start preaching there in a couple of minutes. So we had to sort of rearrange the order of things. So some of you are joining us from another Sunday school class. So what I'm going to do for a minute is just sort of give us a review of what's happened. For people who have been in the class for a while, it'll be a review. This is our third week. For those of us who have not been in the class, it'll be sort of a level set for what we've been talking about, what we're going to continue to talk about in the class around mental health and the church. We've been going for, and Dave's going to come next week. Did I say that? Dave's going to come next week, and I'll explain what he's going to do next week. So the 7 weeks course has been divided. We sort of thought of it in 3 chapters. The first chapter is sort of how do we create community? So in my prayer, I talked about how we're committed to being part of the body of Christ. And that means that we're in each other's lives and we're trying to help each other as fellow believers. And so how do we come to this? How do we come to mental health issues from a relational lens? How are we supposed to be in this hard space with each other? We talked in the first week about creating brave space, a space where it's okay to not be okay, and where we can talk to each other about the hardships that we're facing, where we can say, I'm not well, I need some help. Or we can say, I'm looking at you and I think you're struggling. Is there something that I can do? So how do we do that relationally? So that's the first chapter. And we talked about that last week and 2 weeks ago. The second chapter is, what does the Bible say about it? What's the theology of this? Dave's going to come next week and talk to us about that. Dave, his job, his title is he's the director of the Intersect program, which is designed, it's an access program where I work, and it's designed to help churches and providers of service sort of come together around folks who are struggling. And a lot of times historically, there's a gap, what churches think and how they view people in struggle, and then what providers of service think and how they view people who are struggling. And so it's designed to sort of bring that together. And so out of that work, he has a lot to say about the theology of mental illness and what the Bible has to say about that. So he's going to come next week and talk to us about that. That's chapter 2. What I'm doing today is a little bit out of order. We're going to start with chapter 3, which is sort of how do we talk about the topics of mental illness and the related topics of it. So today we're going to talk about mental illness and addiction. and how they go together. And the question for us in these topical sessions, which is going to be the next couple out after Dave comes, we're going to talk about suicide. We're going to talk about how do we live with somebody in our family or loved one who has a mental health issue, and what do we do about that? The mantra for all of these topical issues, the way we're going to approach it is the same each time, which is how do we move towards it? How do we say, I'm not well, I need help? Or how do we say, I'm looking at you and I think you're struggling. How do we move towards you? How do we move towards it? How do we sit with it? Because it turns out it's a struggle and it's messy and it's hard to know what to do. So how do we sit with it? And then the third part of that mantra is how do we get help when we need it? Okay, so that's how we're going to sort of move through the rest of the course. So we talked about also in our first week, we laid out two other lenses, two other ways that we're going to look at the issue of mental health and the church, mental illness in the church. And the first one is a wellness lens. So what we said is that people who do really well, who are in recovery, who manage their mental health, manage their addiction, manage their other struggles, the people who are doing that really well have figured out wellness. It's not that the thing disappears, it's just that they know how to live with it and how to do well with that thing. And so we also talked about how the pandemic has landed on all of us and how a lot of people are doing less well now than they were before. And it's not so much just because the pandemic happened. That was the catalyst. That was the instrument that pushed it. But it was really because a lot of us hadn't figured out wellness. We didn't need to because there was nothing sort of slapping us in the face about that. But a pandemic has brought out the issue that we need to work on our own wellness and we need to help each other in this community of believers. We need to help each other be well. So that's one of the lenses that we will continue to look at topics related to mental illness through the lens of wellness. And then the other part is looking at it through the lens of experience. So there's lots of theories and lots of ideas, but we're also going to look at this, all the topics that we bring up through the lens of experience, either a person who's living with it or living next to it. So in addition to the professional aspects of it, or the biblical aspects of it, is what is it like to experience it and how do we learn about helping each other through that? So that's the big overview. So today we're going to talk about the topic of mental illness and addiction. And I'm going to do some talking for a little bit. I'm going to share a little bit of my experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And at the end, we'll see where we are. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions. I'm also hoping that this is the start of a conversation that keeps going. So let's just sort of see where we go. I've arranged sort of the conversation around a number of big ideas is what I'm calling. The first big idea is that there is a really large connection, an overlap between mental illness and substance use. So if you look at the research, and there's a lot of it, and you can unpack it and get sort of lost in the weeds and the details, what kind of substance, what kind of diagnosis, all of that stuff. What I want you to know, sort of in a really rough, broad brushstroke, is that it's about 50%. 50% of people who struggle with depression also use a substance. About 50% of people who use a substance, if you sort of sit with them long enough, you'll figure out that there's also a connected mental health issue. Most people in either of those categories have had some sort of traumatic event in their life. So there's this big correlation between these two issues and having them together. So in the world of services, we talk about this as a co-occurring disorder. It's the label of that. It is a double whammy to try to figure out how to get help for or how to talk about. So it makes it even harder for us as a group of people trying to sort this out, to sort of figure out how do we broach the subject, how do we deal with it. There are also sort of related to that, there are a couple of things that make sense. I mean, I'm not condoning any of this. I'm just saying it makes sense. One is that oftentimes people who are struggling with mental illness are medicated. There's something really uncomfortable, something really wrong, and the use of a substance helps make that better. It's not a solution in the long term, it becomes a problem. But in the moment, it makes things a little bit easier to manage. The second thing is, God made us as whole people. So he made our spiritual being, he made our social being, he made our emotional being, he made our physical being. And so as we are creative, there's lots of things, in a very complicated way, there's lots of things that can go sort of sideways in our brain chemistry. And so there's a strong evidence that folks who struggle with both of these things, or one or the other, there's something that's not quite right in the brain functioning, in the brain chemistry. And so when you alter that by taking a substance, it addresses that. Again, maybe not in a solution-focused way, but it adjusts it in a way that makes the moment a little bit easier. When we take aspirin or Tylenol or an antibiotic or medication for depression, we're also adding a chemical to our brain that helps us in some way. So it makes sense that sometimes that happens, even when a person who's self-medicating, it's not helping them in the long run, and that has to be addressed at some point. But it makes sense that somehow that happens, and that's why it happens. So let's talk about me for a second. Back in the very first week, if you were there in the first week, I said that I had a mantra, a six-word memoir. If you weren't in the class, it's a thing where you say something in 6 words. You can Google it. There's all sorts of people that say all sorts of profound things in 6 words. So whether this is profound or not, it's my 6-word memoir, which is live with depression, live without alcohol. Right, so that's something that I've had to figure out. I have other mantras. It's not my only one. That seems a little gloomy, doesn't it? Just as an aside, but my one for my life is actually out of Micah, and it's act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. So I think if I can do that, that's sort of a lifetime sort of 6-word memoir. But when it comes to this, it's live with depression, live without alcohol. When it comes to the issue of my use of alcohol in the past, there's another 6-word memoir that I use that to sort of describe it, to sort of help me understand it. And that is, I broke and then I drank. Right? So lots of folks have a struggle for a period of time with some sort of mental health issue. And that's what happened to me. I didn't know it. It took me a while to figure it out. It happened to me before I understood what was happening. So, and I won't bore you with all the details, but the metaphor in my mind is like a wooden ship. I'm not very nautical, but it's what I imagine wooden ships to be like. They were out in the ocean for a while, and then from time to time you brought them back and you dry docked them, you scrape the barnacles off because they weigh a lot over time, and you dry everything out and you recaulk the seams, seal it, and make it seaworthy again. And if you don't do that, the ship gets waterlogged and it gets a little lower in the water, a little harder to steer. It's not very seaworthy, right? So that was me. I didn't pay attention to my wellness. This is why wellness is important. I didn't pay attention to my wellness. I work in a field of helping other people. And I didn't take care of myself. And so when you're sitting over a long period of time with other people's stuff, it's like barnacles, like it sort of gets to you when it sits a little heavy on you. You might not notice it at first because you just aren't paying attention. It's below the waterline, right? So then a storm comes or a couple of big waves, and you're just not able to manage that circumstance of the storm and the waves. And so it was about a decade ago. There were a couple of years in a row that were really, really, really hard. And it was across a number of sort of domains of my life. It was family, it was my wife's health, it was stuff going on with our kids, it was stuff at work. There was leadership here at the church. I mean, there's lots of things that sort of can barnacle you up, right? So there was a series of things that came together, and it created sort of a series of waves. They were really big waves, and I didn't quite see them coming. And then when I did see them coming, I couldn't turn my boat. So it sort of capsized me. And so I started drinking. And I didn't set out to do that. It wasn't something that I made a decision about. It just started to happen. And then it took on a life of its own, because it really isn't a way to solve that problem. But it works for a moment to help you manage what's in front of you. So that's the connection for me. And it's statistically true for many, many people. And so I'm just sharing with you from my experience that this is a reality that a lot of people live with. It's really hard, we'll get to that in a second. It's really hard to ask for help. So we'll get to that in a minute. But I just segued into what my second big idea was, which is nobody sets out to have a mental illness. Nobody sets out to have an addiction. And so the next couple ideas that we talk about, if you go back to that mantra that we said about how do we move towards it, how do we sit with it, and how do we get help when we need to, there's some things about both mental health and addiction that make it really hard to talk about, makes it hard to move towards it. And one of the things is that it's really hard to see it in yourself, and it's really hard to ask for help. So the first thing is that both mental illness and substance use often cloud a person's thinking. And so they might not see it. And so if you might see it in somebody else and you say, I think there's a problem, I think we want to talk about it. The person might say, there's not a problem, I'm good. And maybe that person doesn't want to talk about it. But maybe it's that they don't see it, right? So over the course, when we talk about what do I do to be well, one of the things that and I think I've said this to some of you before, we have an arrangement at my house where Brenda gets to say to me, my wife, for those of you who don't know me, my wife gets to say to me, how are you doing? And I'm not allowed to say fine. I might actually be fine, but I have to find a different vocabulary word for that. And I have to sort of explain it a lot of times. Because when she would ask me, how are you doing? I'd say fine. That was really code for I don't want to talk about it. The reason she was asking is she knew better. She knew there was something not quite right. She was moving towards it, and I wasn't feeling able to move towards it. So it clouds our thinking. And then the second part of it that's really, really hard are the feelings that go with it. Right? So the feelings that go with it are oftentimes, for me, it was shame. And shame is a super powerful thing. It keeps us talking about all sorts of things because we're afraid what will happen if I let this out? What will this person think of me? What will this person say about this to me? Will this damage our relationship in some way that's not retrievable? Will it hurt it so much? There's vulnerability, there's guilt. Ed Welch, who some of you may have heard of, there's some literature in the backtrack over there. I think he's from CCCEF. He wrote a really good book about shame and about the implications of shame and how to deal with it from a biblical perspective. But knowing about shame and being able to sort of deal with the shame that you're feeling is sort of hard. So there was a point in time when I realized that there was a problem and I couldn't tell anybody. My problem, it wasn't that I didn't know it, it was that I couldn't say it out loud. Fortunately for me, and this is that brave space part, people who knew me said, Mark, we know you have a problem. We're not even asking. We know you have a problem and you need to get some help. And so Dave, when he comes and talks next week, he has a saying. But one of the things we do for each other is we give the gift of going second. When we hear that somebody else has struggled the same way. So today, I hope I'm giving all of us the gift of going second, right? When you say that this is something that I've had to deal with, or this is going on for me, and the next person says, oh, yeah, me too. They can say it a little more readily because you went first. You gave the gift of going second. So people did that for me. That they entered bravely into a brave space, and they went first. And so once they went first, then I could go get some help. And as I went and got help, I realized also that this was related to depression, and that I hadn't really figured out depression and what it was doing to me, and that was or how all this stuff was working together. But the thing that started it was relational for me. The thing that started me getting help was relational. So big idea number 4 is that it's really hard to offer help when relationships have been damaged or hurt. right? So, or even broken. So when you bring up something to somebody else, they might deny it. They might say this is not a problem. They may not see the impact that either of these things or these things together or had on people around them. I kind of had a sense, but I still couldn't figure out what to do about it. It requires a combination of a couple things, a combination of grace and honesty. And it also requires a combination of boundaries and connection. So sometimes, so you might say, I think this person that I know has a problem, but maybe you're not the person to bring it up, right? Because your relationship is a specific one with this person, or it may be too hard within your relationship to bring it up, or you may have too many other things in your relationship that you have to work on or manage to be able to be the person to bring this up. You can't love somebody out of mental illness, and you can't love somebody out of an addiction. If that were enough, it would happen. And so sometimes what then happens is people get angry or resentful or bitter, or they sort of, or dependent, codependent. So there's this connection that this sort of dysfunctional, and then there's this breaking away because it hasn't landed in a place that's really, that can manage the existence of it. So there's a couple things that are helpful, but it takes this brave space. So and the last day, the seventh week, we're going to talk about, so how do we come full circle and say, here at Covenant, how do we help each other out? How do we have these conversations? But you might have to say to somebody, I have this struggle with somebody that I know and care about. It could be a coworker, it could be a loved one, it could be a family member. I'm just not sure how to have this conversation. I don't know if I am the one to have this conversation. You might have to say to somebody else who's struggling, maybe you need to set a boundary with this person. This is what's okay, and this is what's not okay. There's a whole other conversation too. It's a different Sunday school class maybe on how to set boundaries and what are they. Brene Brown says it's very simple. Says it very simply. It's what's okay and what's not okay. And so sometimes we have to set boundaries in love. Say, I just can't live with this thing, or I can't participate in this thing, and then watch a person. I had a conversation through work a couple weeks ago. A woman let her ex-husband come back to her house. He was homeless, and he was homeless related to his substance use, his addiction. And she created some space for him to come back because he was going to go to jail. And the probation officer said, yes, if he's there, it'll be fine. The next call I got, he had been rearrested. He had taken his sons, they have a son together. He had taken his son's bike. He was just going to go out to help somebody, but he went out and used again. And then some other bad things sort of happened. So she called me because she didn't know where he was until just then. She got a call from jail asking him asking her to bail him out. And she said, what should I do? And I said, well, so we walked through this. How do you set a boundary? And what did you do? You offered him an opportunity that he wasn't quite ready to take. He wasn't able to make use of that opportunity because he's still very active in his addiction. And so we talked about setting a boundary with love. This is super hard because she also said, I'm afraid he's going to die. And I don't want him to die. And so I'm really having a hard time setting this boundary. So when I say set boundaries in love, I understand how messy that is, how hard that is. But those are the things that we have to be able to, when we create spaces together as a community, we have to be able to, that's the sitting part. Moving towards it says, what's wrong? Sitting with it says, wow, this is super hard. And I don't even know how I would do this if I were you, but let's be in this together and know that I'm here to support you. Where are we? The last big idea is that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. It is, but only kind of. The opposite of addiction is connection. So you have to figure out your relationship with a substance, and you have to change that relationship. But the people who do really well are people who are connected to support, connected relationally. So I will tell you that for me, it's connection to God, and it's connection and deep relationship with other people. Why is that important? Because oftentimes when we look at people, and this is also, I should have said this earlier in one of my big idea number 2, nobody sets out to have an addiction. A lot of times, one of the things that makes it hard when we deal with each other about this is it looks like choice. If you would just make some better decisions, life would be better. And so we do all this. We do this also with somebody struggling with mental illness. If you would choose to get treatment in the way that I think treatment should be happening, then you would probably be better. We would be better. Right? So when we look relationally at the person that's struggling, is we wish that they would just make better choices and behave differently. And it's really complex, and it's not that easy. I will tell you that I prayed to be relieved of this. And then I couldn't figure out why that prayer wasn't being answered. And the answer that I figured out was God was taking care of it around the things that I can't do for myself. So that's a saying I learned. God will do for me the things I can't do for myself. But God also requires me to do the things that I can do. And for me, the thing I had to do was to talk to another human. Talking to God, there's a saying, if you want forgiveness, pray, talk to God. If you want to change, talk to another person, because then we're accountable to another human being. So that connection is what we need to find in recovery, connection with other people. So the connections that I work on are my connection with God and my connection with other people, that's grounded in this conversation, me being honest about what I've experienced and me figuring out what my wellness needs to look like. So those are the first two things. How do we move towards it? And how do we sit with it? And I know that I'm sort of rushing through this, and it's more complicated, it's more complex when we're actually living in it. But that's what we need to do. We need to be, when we enter bravely into a space, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We want to control the outcome. We want to know. Sharon, you brought up in the first week. Lots of times we want to be more in control than we actually are able to be in control. So when we step into brave space, we step in on the strength of our relationship, believing that when we do that, we're doing the right thing and that God will honor that. We're giving to God the outcome, but we're stepping into that space, even though it's probably remarkably uncomfortable to us. So moving towards it, sitting with it, and then getting help if you need to. I'm going to give you a couple resources, and at the end of this class, we will send out a resource sheet for all the weeks we've talked about. So, and you can come to me afterwards, and I'll write down for you or give it to you. But I'm just going to give them today. The first two are AA and Al-Anon. AA is for folks who are struggling with an addiction of alcohol. Al-Anon is for people who are living with somebody who is, or know somebody, and it's very helpful to figure out how to move towards it, sit with it, and sort of live in that space. I'm going to come back to AA in a second. There's also NA, Narcotics Anonymous, or and it has another. I'm going to get it wrong. I can't remember the word of it, but it's for folks who have a loved one who's also struggling with some other sort of substance. There's a couple other, and then I'm going to come back to AA and sort of talk a little bit about why it's hard for us to figure out AA. Some other resources. Breathing Underwater is a book by a guy named Richard Rohr. I don't agree with all his theology, but he's really good on this piece. And Breathing Underwater is his walking through the steps of AA and drawing direct correlation to biblical principles. So it's sort of helping us understand how to crosswalk the things that people get taught in AA and biblical principles that you and I, as a community of believers, can sort of get on board with. That's a very good book. A second one that's also very good is called Addiction and Grace, which is love and spirituality and the healing of addiction. And that's written by Gerald May. He's a doctor and a believer. And it's a very well-written book. Another one resource is Celebrate Recovery, which is a very, very Christian-oriented, Christ-oriented approach to the 12-step program. So I believe that if you look at AA well, it's completely, entirely compatible with my beliefs as a Christian. I don't have a problem with those two things. So I go to AA a lot. I also go to Celebrate Recovery because it's like going to church. Really, there's worship. It's a very, very Christ-centered discussion of the 12 steps and principles. They have a lot of really practical, good literature that's very Christian-oriented, that talks about all sorts of these topics: substance use, domestic violence, food addiction, sexual addiction, pornography. It addresses all of these topics in a very candid, very, very Christ-centered way. If you go down 113 Franconia, and you pass the big Franconia church there on the left, if you're going out towards Dotterton on the left, you'll see a big banner, Celebrate Recoveries Monday nights. That's what this is. So there are churches that that sponsor that program. I want us to go back for a minute and talk about AA, because when I talked about Dave having a foot in the church world and in the service provision world, there's a lot of suspicion across the aisle that goes on between AA and between the church. And I just wanted to talk as a person who's been in all of that. I want to allay some concerns. There's a saying, contempt prior to investigation. And so I think a lot of times people get a worry about something when they don't really know all of the details. So one of the things that I see on the church side is that in the literature, the phrase is used, God as I understand him. And so people say, well, they're just making up any crazy God that they want, and they're not really focused on God, and they're not really focused on Jesus and God. And the way, when you sit and unpack it, all of us understand God as a growth. What we know about God today is not the same. I grew up in the church, and what I know about God at almost 60 is way different from what I know about, or how I understood God at 6 when I walked down the aisle at a Baptist church to say, please, I want some of that, right? And so God, the point is that regardless of how I understand God in this moment, I need to act. So the God of my understanding will help me, even though I don't understand him really well. And what that does is, for the person who comes in and saying, I need to stop drinking, I need to stop using a substance, I hear that this involves God. I have no idea how that all works. The answer is welcome. The God of your understanding, however you understand right now, is a real God that's really going to help you. The other side of the coin is lots of people come into AA very skeptical of God. And what I found is that people's struggle with God, either I don't believe God or I'm really mad at God. And so I'm having a hard time coming and sitting here and listening about God. One of two things has happened. Either something tragic has happened, something very bad has happened. And what they say is, how could God let this happen? I have a good friend in AA who came in very upset at God and saying, I don't know if I even believe in God. His daughter had pediatric cancer. And so he was saying, how did that happen with a loving God? This is a normal question for people to ask. This is the book of Job, actually. Like there's a point. We all have this question. And so it shouldn't shouldn't preclude you from coming in and figuring out how God might help you manage a substance use or manage a mental health issue and substance use. The other thing that happens, quite honestly, that makes people really cynical or skeptical or not really wanting to talk about how God might help them in their management of mental illness or substance use, is that somebody has done something to them, did something to them in the past in the name of God. they had a bad experience with somebody who didn't sit well, who didn't enter that brave space very well with them. And so it turned them off to that. And so a big part of Celebrate Recovery, certainly, and also AA, is to help people understand that their relationship with God isn't contingent on their behavior of the moment, that things can get better, and that God will help them do that. Where are we in terms of time? We have a couple minutes left. So what I'd like to do is just sort of stop. I babbled. I said a lot of words. So what I want to do is just stop and ask people for thoughts or questions or response. And if you are in the Zoom world, if you want to put it in the chat, Jim's monitoring the chat, so we'll be able to call it out from there. But from the room, thoughts, questions, pushback. John.
It's all rolling. Mark, thank you so much. And not only for this class in general, but it's very hard to share personal things about yourself, as you said, and your struggles, and some of your darkest times, and so on. Just want to say thank you for doing this. That's important. We need that. We need to be able to talk more freely and trusting people about these kind of things. So thanks for going first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this is very timely for us. We just moved into the area. With a new move and new to retirement, all those things that the articles that have been attached to our trip. Yeah, it's very timely for us. We're looking forward to proceeding.
Thank you. Do you want to add to that?
More honest and open. I feel similar to what you're saying. I'm the one with the medical illness. I'm the one whose ship was capsized. I'm the one who ended up in the emergency room in desperate need. I'm working through this, and I may be even having a meeting with Dave on Tuesday.
Okay.
I'm sure. I have great hope. I've been through a whole lot. I've been through different counselors. Right now, I have that hope because God has brought me through a lot of things. I know that He will bring me through this. My thing is, and I can't get it across to my husband, I'm not ashamed of having this problem. I know that there are thousands of people who have problems. And if I was more open with it and more sharing with it, that somebody else might come to me and say, I have that problem too. And I think that's what we as the church needs to be, that is more transparent and say, look, I have problems in life. I'm not, we share as a nurse, everybody shares, oh, I have diabetes, I have heart disease, but they won't share this. And it's, you can get help. There's help out there. I have to be medicated, so it's just like a diabetic. I have to have medicine too for my brain to work correctly.
Yeah.
It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's more important that we get the help.
Yeah. So, thank you. Okay. Okay, that was a mouthful. I don't know if I can recap it real well. I don't know that I can do justice to it. So for the people in the Zoom land, it was just a discussion about how we need to be able to talk to each other, that there's not shame really in struggling with a mental health issue, and that you're doing that you're working your way through it. And you pointed out that when it comes to other things that we struggle with, physical things that we struggle with, we can often say that I have diabetes, or I have heart disease, or I have these other things wrong with me. I have cancer. I think these things are, you can talk about, where they become really hard. The mental health struggles or the addiction that we struggle with also, and that we should be able, we need to be able to. There's some feedback. You have taken us back to sort of one of the big sort of legs, the foundational pieces of why we wanted to do this course and how we wanted to do it. We could give a lot of information out from professional people, from people who have lived experience, but if we don't have a space that says, we know that we need to be able to talk about it, and we know that we need to enter that space, even though it feels uncomfortable. That's a powerful thing. One of the things that we talked about, I think, it was in the Brene Brown video. That was a very short clip. I was otherwise detained last week, so I don't know if you guys watched it together or whether we left that as a, but it's very short. And really what it talks about is as being empathetic. And what it says is, empathy is when we say, I don't even know how to say, what to say. I don't have words for this, but I'm so glad that you shared. It's about connection. The most powerful thing that we have to offer each other is really connection. And connection as of the body of Christ is really a super powerful connection that we have with each other. What it requires, that stepping into, that moving towards it, requires us to be able to sit with our own discomfort. It's hard for us to do that. And so this class, hopefully people leave this whole series with a sense that it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to be uncomfortable and start the conversation. And somebody has to go first. Like, you have to start it. And once you do, even though you're worried about what will happen, it usually ends up much better than we had anticipated. So thank you for sharing. I also wanted to say that this also sort of takes us to this sense of wellness. So people who are in recovery, whether that's around their mental health issues, around substance issues, around both of those things together, people who are doing that are figuring out wellness. So you talked about the role of medication in your wellness, right? All of those things go into sort of how we figure it out for ourselves and how we figure that out in a community of supporting people. So that's part of all of us have something to do with our own wellness and with somebody else's wellness. So thanks. Any other sort of last minute? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, thank you again. I mean, it's really, sometimes you think it's a little thing to share your story, but it's such a huge thing. It really kind of evens the playing field for some people. Mental health test our family. And then I will share. You commented on addiction, and it's very helpful. I think there's layers of stigma with mental health, and then there's also a stigma with addiction. My daughter has received a traumatic event in our family with my father passing away. He literally put her on the bus, became ill, and never talked or walked again. Very sudden. It brought out a lot of stuff in her at age 5. And we were able to pick it up because she had to watch TV all the time to hear the flat screen. But it got to the point where if I would turn the TV off, she fell on the floor like, Mom, this is the only thing to get the voices out of my head. And to hear your little girl, you're kind of like, wait, what was that? And it was so pure and innocent to see this very little girl who didn't have access to alcohol or any other thing, but just trying to cope with something that she didn't even know she had. So for us, it's very real to see how you kind of said choice, because people who don't suffer from addiction, choice seems such a big part of it. But that was just a kind of fundamental way to see how these things evolve. And it's not a choice, it's trying to just get through. So even putting a number to 50% is, I think, helpful for the individual and the people with them.
For those of you in Zoom land, there was a discussion about a young person, a daughter, who went through a traumatic event and then is struggling with things, OCD, as a result of that. And just sort of the fact that this is a life event sort of landed on her, and to see it that way is helpful. Most of the people that I see struggling in any of this, in either one or other or both of them together, are really people who are just trying to cope with the day or the week or the month. Most mental illness is complex. It has a lot of different features. And so I talked about the brain a little bit. That's true, but it's not either or. Most mental illness, even really extreme mental illness like schizophrenia or thought disorders, that kind of thing, are related to a lived experience. So we might have a predisposition. I believe that I have some predisposition in the way I was made physically, but it took life experiences that landed on me to sort of activate all that. And I didn't understand it when it happened. And your point, you can be in the helping professions. You were a nurse, or you are a nurse. Like it doesn't. This can happen to anybody. I know we're running out of time, but the opioid epidemic, I think, is a tribute to how easily it can hit anybody, and it's not like you're better than somebody else, and you're going to be sort of impervious to it. It lands on all of us. So thank you for sharing. Go ahead, Erna, and then we need to wrap up.
Is it possible to be able to refer someone from our congregation or somewhere else who has not seen a series of classes to be able to go on the Covenant website and pick this class up in the future?
Sure, and we're recording it, so
It will always be there, it will be there for some time.
yeah. Yeah. We will also earn a sort of as this course, this is a stone rolling down a hill, gathering some things. So when we get to the bottom, we will have a list of like, when you need to go get more help, here are some ways to do that. Okay. All right, let me close in prayer. People are coming in. So thank you, God, for being present with us in this conversation. Thank you again for the way that you've made us and that you're sovereign over your world and over us as individuals. We thank you that you do your work of caring for us through the people that we have in our lives, and you use each of us as your instruments, as your source of help for other people. And so we'd ask that you will help us be mindful of that and help us to be brave and be able to start a conversation with somebody that we think is struggling, or to ask for help when we need it. Bless the rest of our morning for the worship today. And we thank you again for all these things in the name of your Son. Amen. You're turning the recording off, Jim.